Welcome to Life Stories, where we share emotional and heartwarming tales that remind us of the power of love, family, and second chances. Today's story follows a billionaire CEO, Ryan Mitchell, who is forced to confront his past when he meets a boy at his father's grave, a boy he never knew existed. Through the pain of lost time and the discovery of secrets buried deep, Ryan is given a second chance to be the father he never was. Join us as we explore the profound lessons of life, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Please subscribe to our channel to begin today's story. Ryan Mitchell adjusted his coat as he walked slowly through the cemetery, the gravel crunching softly beneath his polished shoes. It was a cool, late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. A bouquet of white lilies rested in his hand, their delicate petals reflecting the dimming light. He had come here every year, on the anniversary of his father's death, to pay his respects, though it had never gotten any easier. 4 years had passed, but the weight of regret and unanswered questions still lingered. His father, Charles Mitchell, had been a man of influence, power, and, above all, ambition. The kind of man who built empires but could never bring himself to understand the complexities of love or family. Ryan had been groomed to take over the company, to carry on the legacy. But at what cost? His relationship with his father had been strained, and as the years passed, their connection had only grown colder. Ryan had always been driven by a need to prove himself, to succeed in the world of business. But in doing so, he had sacrificed the most important relationships in his life. The one person he had ever loved truly, Sarah Thompson, was now a distant memory. And the son he never knew he had, well, that was something he had never considered until now. As he reached the familiar headstone, Ryan paused for a moment. The name was engraved in bold, simple letters: Charles Mitchell, beloved husband and father. There was something cold and unfeeling about it, as if his father's entire legacy could be reduced to a few impersonal words on a stone. Ryan sighed and placed the bouquet carefully on the ground, smoothing the edges as if neatness could somehow make up for the years of silence and regret. There were so many things he wished he could have said to his father: accusations, apologies, confessions, yet, every year, he said nothing. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of his own unresolved feelings pressing against his chest. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A boy, no older than 10, was kneeling a few feet away, half hidden in the shadow of a marble angel. His thin frame was hunched over, and he was speaking softly, his lips moving soundlessly as if he were whispering a prayer. Ryan couldn't hear what the boy was saying at first, but there was something about his posture, something about the way he looked at the grave, that made Ryan's chest tighten. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered, his head bowed low. "I didn't mean to bother you, Grandpa." Ryan blinked, taking a step closer. The words didn't make sense. He had been visiting this grave for years, and there had never been anyone else buried here. He took a deep breath and cleared his throat, unsure of how to approach the situation. The boy flinched and looked up, his wide eyes meeting Ryan's with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "Hey," Ryan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think you've got the wrong grave, kid." The boy blinked a few times, a look of pure confusion washing over his face. He shook his head slowly, as if unsure of what to say next. "No," the boy mumbled. "Mom said this is Grandpa's grave. She told me where to find it." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way the boy could be referring to his father. Especially not in this way. His fingers tightened around the edge of his coat as a cold shiver ran down his spine. The boy continued, his voice small but filled with a quiet determination. "Mom said you didn't want us," he said softly, his gaze flicking between Ryan and the headstone. "She didn't want me to come. But I wanted to see." Ryan felt a strange wave of emotion rush over him. A mix of disbelief, anger, and something deeper, more profound. His father's name was carved into the stone in front of him. And suddenly it felt like a trap. A heavy weight pressing down on him from all sides. His father had always demanded loyalty and sacrifice. But he never told Ryan the most important thing of all, that he had a son. The boy's words echoed in Ryan's mind. A cruel reminder of everything he had lost and never knew he had. "Who's your mom?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his throat tightening as he spoke. The boy hesitated, scuffing the toe of his sneaker against the gravel before answering. "Emily," he said quietly. "Emily Carter." Ryan's breath caught in his chest. The name hit him like a punch. Emily. He hadn't heard it in over a decade. He remembered the summer they had spent together. Before everything went wrong. Before his father's threats and his own ambitions had torn them apart. He had loved Emily once. Recklessly. All at once. But his father had never accepted her. And Ryan, eager to follow in his father's footsteps, had walked away. The guilt, the regret, it all came rushing back in a flood of memories. Too painful to bear. Ryan looked down at the boy. His son, standing in front of him. The boy's features were so familiar, his dark brown hair, the sharp line of his jaw, the way he carried himself, so much like Ryan's own. But it wasn't just his face that was familiar. It was his eyes, the way they looked up at Ryan as if he were searching for something. The same eyes Emily had. It was as if Ryan had been staring into a mirror for the first time in years. And the reflection was staring back at him. "You're my son," Ryan whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. It felt like a dream. Like something he couldn't possibly understand. Yet the truth was standing right in front of him. The boy's shoulders hunched as if he were unsure of what to say next. His hands curling into the sleeves of his hoodie. He looked up at Ryan. His voice barely audible. "Mom didn't want me to find you." The boy mumbled. "She said you didn't care. But I wanted to know." Ryan's heart broke as the weight of the boy's words settled in. He didn't know. He didn't know that his son had been living a life without him. That Sarah had raised him alone. That his father's interference had caused all of this. All the pain. All the separation. Ryan wanted to argue. To deny it. But the truth was right there in front of him. The boy, his son, standing alone in front of a grave. Trying to make sense of a past he couldn't possibly understand. Ryan stood frozen for a moment. His mind racing to catch up with the words that the boy, his son, had just spoken. "I didn't know," Ryan muttered, his voice rough with disbelief. The weight of the moment felt suffocating. The cemetery air pressing down on him as he stared at the boy before him. Ethan, the name seemed to resonate now. As it felt as if it had always been there. Waiting for him to know it. The young boy, barely 10, looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and defiance. Ethan's eyes held a question that Ryan didn't know how to answer. They were filled with the same spark that had once drawn Ryan to Emily. But it was also filled with something else. Something Ryan could not ignore, pain. The same kind of ache he had felt when he lost Emily. "How long have you known?" Ryan finally managed to ask. His voice hoarse. Ethan shifted awkwardly on the ground, brushing dirt from his jeans. He seemed to be debating whether or not to say anything more. His eyes dropped to the ground. And for a moment, it felt as though he was trying to hide behind the weight of his own words. But then, he looked up again, his gaze steady, almost too mature for someone so young. "Since last year," he confessed quietly, "I found a picture of you and Mom in her closet." Ryan felt as though the earth beneath him shifted. A picture, a single photograph had revealed what a decade of silence had hidden. Emily had kept it, kept him alive in her memory. It made sense now, the way Sarah had always seemed to hold on to their shared past. The way she would mention Ryan only in passing. Never openly, never fully. Ethan had found it, and something had clicked into place for him. His need to know, to understand who Ryan was, had started there. "I asked her about it," Ethan continued, his voice small but firm. "But she got mad. She said it didn't matter. But I looked you up online." Ethan's words seemed to hang in the air, quiet but laden with meaning. "I saw you on TV. You looked different. You looked cold, polished, like a stranger. You're always wearing a suit. Like you're too busy making deals to think about anything else. The words stung, sharper than Ryan had expected. He wanted to protest, to tell Ethan that it wasn't true, that he hadn't been cold by choice. But he couldn't. The truth was written all over the boy's face, the truth that had been buried for years. Ryan had made choices, the wrong choices, and they had cost him everything. His father had pushed him down the path of success, of business, of being the heir to the empire. And in doing so, Ryan had let go of the only thing that had ever mattered, his family. I didn't know, Ryan said again, his voice raw with guilt. I swear, Ethan, I didn't know. If I had known, I would have been there. I would have tried. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, and he pulled his coat tighter around him. Mom said you'd say that. She said you'd pretend to care just to make yourself feel better. He said, almost whispering the last words as though they were something he had been forced to repeat for years. The boy was defensive, distant, yet there was a vulnerability beneath his words, a child still waiting for answers. Ryan felt as though he had been struck. Every word Ethan spoke seemed to rip open a wound in his chest that he hadn't even known existed. She said I didn't want a family. Ethan continued, his voice trembling slightly. The words echoed in Ryan's mind, like the cruelest of truths. The ache of regret that he'd carried for so long now seemed heavier. Deeper. Emily had believed that about him. Believed he didn't care, and he had let her believe it. I was wrong, Ryan whispered, his voice faltering. I should have been there. I should have known. Ethan didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked down at his sneakers. His face unreadable. It was clear that the boy was processing, trying to figure out what to do with this revelation. Just as Ryan was. Ryan crouched down to the boy's level, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan, I didn't leave because I didn't want a family, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was confused, and I listened to the wrong people. I didn't know that you were out there. But now that I know. He paused, looking into Ethan's eyes. I'll make it right, I promise. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He just stared at him, as if measuring Ryan's sincerity, as if deciding whether to believe him. Ryan could see the skepticism in his eyes. The walls that had been built up to protect him from the disappointment he had known for most of his life. It would take more than a promise to undo the years of hurt. The silence between them stretched long. But Ryan didn't look away. The boy needed more than words now, he needed action. Ryan felt the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was his son. The little boy standing before him, uncertain and frightened, was his flesh and blood. He had never known what it meant to be a father. But now, in this moment, he knew that he had to be there for him, no matter what it took. Do you think your mom would be upset if I took you home with me? Ryan asked gently, offering the boy a small but warm smile. It was a simple question, but it felt like the beginning of something much bigger, an opportunity to make amends. To start anew. The drive to Sarah's apartment was quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional soft breath from Ethan in the passenger seat. Ryan's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles pale, as he navigated through the quiet streets, his mind racing with 100 thoughts. His father's grave, the boy he had just met, and now, this unexpected role he had found himself in. The role of a father to a child who had lived without him for so long. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but there was something in Ethan's presence that made Ryan's heart swell with a mix of love and guilt. He couldn't help but glance at the boy now and then, watching as Ethan stared out of the window, his eyes lost in thought. The boy seemed quieter than he had been at the cemetery, more introspective now that they were on the move. Ryan couldn't blame him. Ethan had just learned that the man sitting beside him was his father. The same man who had been absent for his entire life. He had every right to be unsure, to be cautious, but there was also something fragile in the way Ethan had looked at him earlier, a small spark of hope. The possibility that, despite everything, there might be a future between them. As they reached the modest apartment complex on the edge of town, Ryan felt his heart tighten again. The place was a far cry from his own sleek, modern penthouse. The parking lot was cracked. A few bikes chained half-heartedly to a railing. There were no luxury cars. No signs of wealth or status. It was simple, humble, and in that moment, Ryan couldn't help but feel the weight of his own privilege and the stark contrast between his world and the one that Sarah had carved out for herself and Ethan. Ryan pulled into a parking spot, the gravel crunching under the tires, and turned off the engine. Ethan was already out of the car, walking briskly toward the entrance of the building, his small figure silhouetted against the faded brick walls. Ryan followed at a distance, trying to shake the nerves that had suddenly settled in his stomach. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would Sarah be angry? Would she even let him in? The last time he had seen her was over a decade ago. And so much had changed since then. They made their way up the stairs in silence, the faint sound of Ethan's footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. As they reached the third floor, Ryan stopped in front of a door, his heart pounding in his chest. It was an old door, worn and chipped from years of use. The apartment number was crooked, barely visible from age. Ryan's hand hovered over the doorbell, but before he could press it, the door creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Ryan standing there. She looked different, older, wearier. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the last time he saw her. Yet, despite the weariness, she was still unmistakably the same woman he had once loved. Her voice came out hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her gaze flicking between Ryan and Ethan. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry. "Can we talk?" His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as he tried to keep his tone steady. There was so much to say, so much to explain, but he knew that words could never fully undo the years of silence between them. For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. Her expression was unreadable as she glanced down at Ethan, who was standing quietly at Ryan's side. Ethan's eyes were wide, watching his mother, waiting for her permission. After a beat, Sarah's shoulders slumped, and she sighed, her eyes softening slightly. Without a word, she stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Ryan followed Ethan into the small apartment, taking in the simple, tidy living room. The shelves were crammed with well-worn novels, and the faint scent of coffee lingered in the air. There was a couch draped with a knitted blanket, a stark contrast to the sleek, empty spaces of his own home. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it felt warm. It felt like home in a way that Ryan hadn't experienced in years. "Go to your room, Ethan," Sarah murmured, her voice soft but firm. Ethan hesitated for a moment, glancing at Ryan before nodding reluctantly and retreating down the hallway. Ryan watched him go, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. As soon as Ethan was out of sight, Sarah's expression hardened. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes as she turned her gaze back on Ryan. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp. There was no softness, no welcome in her voice. She was angry, and he didn't blame her. Ryan took a deep breath and forced himself to remain calm. "I want to explain," he began, but Sarah cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You want to explain?" she repeated, her voice rising with frustration. "Not after what you did." She stepped closer, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You disappeared, Ryan. You left. You told me to move on, to stop embarrassing myself. I begged you to at least meet him once. And you sent a letter saying you wanted nothing to do with us." Ryan's heart sank, his throat tightening with the sudden rush of guilt. "I didn't write that letter," he said quickly, his voice breaking with the truth. "I swear, Sarah, I never received it." He took a step toward her, his hands trembling. "I didn't know about Ethan. I never would've." Sarah's eyes narrowed, the bitterness still clear in her gaze. "Save it," she snapped, her voice shaking. "I saw the letter, Ryan. I saw your signature at the bottom. You told me you didn't care. The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. His mind was reeling. He had never received that letter. His father's lawyer, Harold, must have intercepted it. Harold, the man who had always done his father's bidding. Who had kept him from Emily. From his son. It was the only explanation that made sense. Ryan's voice trembled as he spoke. The guilt washing over him in waves. I didn't know, Sarah. I swear I didn't know. I would have come if I had. He paused, fighting the lump in his throat. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt him. Sarah's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. But the anger was still there. Simmering beneath the surface. She shook her head, her voice small and bitter. It's too late for apologies. Ryan, you're too late. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her posture stiff with emotion. Ryan's heart ached at the finality in her voice. He had done this. He had made this mistake. He had let his father's influence control his life for so long. And now he was facing the consequences of those choices. And there was no easy way to fix it. There were no words that could take back the years lost. No actions that could erase the damage done. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to walk away again. He couldn't. I'll be here for him, Ryan said quietly, his voice raw with emotion. I'll be here for both of you. Sarah, I won't make the same mistake again. For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. She just stared at him. Her eyes filled with something too complex for Ryan to understand. Finally, she nodded, a small, reluctant gesture. You better, she murmured, her voice softer now. For his sake, Ryan, for his sake. As the days passed, Ryan settled into a routine with Ethan. But nothing felt quite right. There were moments of warmth, quiet afternoons spent building Lego towers. Evenings filled with the soft hum of life, but the weight of lost time still loomed between them. Yet, little by little, the bond that had once been broken started to rebuild. Ethan was still hesitant, still guarding his heart, but Ryan could see the cracks begin to form. Each small gesture of care, every conversation, every shared moment, was a step toward healing. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Ethan turned to Ryan, his small face earnest. Are you going to stay this time? He asked. His voice fragile, as if testing the waters of trust. Ryan's heart clenched, and he knelt down to Ethan's level, looking him in the eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Ryan promised, his voice firm. Steady, I'll always be here, and I'll make sure you know it. Every day. Ethan's eyes softened, and a small smile tugged at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wound was still there. The scar of the years lost. But it was beginning to heal. Together, they would move forward, step by step, through the quiet moments, through the challenges, and through the lessons of life. As Ryan sat back, watching Ethan drift off to sleep, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope stir within him. He had lost so much. But now he had the chance to make things right. For the first time in years. The future didn't seem so uncertain. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and emotional stories. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Life Stories.